Okay, so a very important interglobal relationship between the East and the West, I think, can be exhibited when we look at what these European explorers are doing in the Far East, right? So let's take a closer examination of the Portuguese experience in China. So the end of the overseas explorations by the Chinese. In the previous video, we were talking about Zheng He's voyages. Even though they stopped by the 1430s, this really only marks a temporary period of isolation between China and the outside world. So, despite the fact that I keep emphasizing this idea that China is trying to really remain insular, it's sort of afraid of too much contact with the outside world, this doesn't mean that the Europeans aren't going to try to have access to the Far East. So in 1514, the first Portuguese traders arrive in China. And Portugal, at that point, if you remember from the overseas explorations that we've already discussed in period 4, if you don't, go back to those old videos. They're on this playlist. Portugal was a pioneer in ships and weapons throughout Europe at this point, right? And also, Portugal had already won control of both the African and Indian coast. So, despite the fact that we may not overly emphasize Portugal in the Western Hemisphere, it is certainly very important in the East. So, the Portuguese had a series of forts stretching from Hormuz on the Persian Gulf, which was built in 1507, to Goa in western India, that was 1510, to Malacca on the Malay Peninsula in 1511. And don't forget the significance of the Malacca Strait, right? That's really one of the only routes to get from Central Asia to the Far East, is to go through that little strip of water. And I'll show you on maps where the Malacca Strait is in a few moments in case you forget. So the aim of all these different forts was to establish a monopoly of the spice trade throughout Asia, a Portuguese monopoly, I should stress. So the Portuguese Empire was limited in that it was a series of small colonial outposts. It wasn't control over large territories. So in a lot of ways, then we can contrast it with all the Spanish colonial acquisitions. They're much larger in size, right? The Portuguese, besides Brazil, it has much smaller colonial possessions. So that might be one of the reasons why we don't overly emphasize the Portuguese today. You know, arguably the Spanish were much more successful in the long run in their colonial ventures, but nonetheless, it's so significant for us to realize how much influence the Portuguese do have on outside places during this historical period. They also have a significant religious influence. The Christian missionaries from Portugal start to arrive in China around the 16th century. Most of them were Franciscan and Dominican at first, but later you do have Jesuits also arrive in China. They attempted to win over the Chinese with their scientific and technological knowledge. And I always think that's really interesting because you know, on the one hand, we like to say that in the medieval era, it was the East that was more educated, arguably, right? They were not afraid of interspersing science with more spiritual ideas. But by the time we get to the Renaissance, realize that the Europeans catch up incredibly quickly. So by the time we get these missionary voyages going to the Far East, they really have caught up in a lot of scientific knowledge. This is paralleling the time of Copernicus and Kepler and Galileo and Sir Isaac Newton. So really at this point, the Europeans have caught up significantly in terms of science, and so they're really trying to sort of wow the Chinese with their knowledge. And then once that happens, then they try to influence their other scholarly learning or their other information. So that's how they sort of get their in with the Chinese, by teaching them science, and then they attempt to convert them religiously, right? What's interesting is that the Chinese scholar gentry was not really impressed by the Europeans' efforts at educating them. In general, they tended to see the Europeans as barbaric, uncivilized, which I just think is so interesting because, you know, from the European perspective, it was the other way around. But nonetheless, this information does eventually get through on both sides, so there's significant sort of intellectual influence going back and forth. Um, oops, my mouse is on its own right now. Okay, So one thing that we have to emphasize, I keep saying that the Portuguese sort of, don't get that much historical emphasis when we look at it from today. And there's a reason why that is. The Portuguese, even though they did have significant influence over the Far East, they were very vulnerable at the same time. So let's examine why maybe the Portuguese do not have as long lasting of an impact as, let's say, the Spanish or the English. Part of it is just size, right? Portugal is a very small nation. I mean, you can barely even see it here, right? There it is. There's the green, right? And then notice, I just want you to notice, this is maybe small on your screen, but if we take a second to read the map key, everything that's represented in this shade, right, this sort of pinky red, is all Spanish possessions. So right here's Spain proper, and then we see, I mean, essentially all of New Granada, right? I mean, Chile, Argentina, Peru, parts of actually a little part of Venezuela, and then you have also pretty much all of Mexico, right? All of the west coast of what eventually will become the United States. Spain has a lot of land, right? A lot of territory, and also almost the entire Caribbean. Portuguese possessions, by contrast, yes, it has Brazil, which is very large, but a lot of Brazil at this point was sort of difficult to colonize. It's vast rainforest territory. They do have significant sugar plantations, though, on the coasts. And then other than that, notice the smaller Portuguese possessions. So they do have some possessions in Africa, these colonial trade outposts, and they also do have various ports. Here is the Strait of Malacca, by the way, what I keep talking about, right? And so they do have some possessions there, but they're much smaller. So many, because of that size, Portugal as a nation lacked the manpower and the navy necessary to enforce or maintain such a large trade empire. So actually many Portuguese merchants decided to just ignore any restrictions that the government placed on their trade, and they just traded independently. So in some ways we could see that the Portuguese are almost trying to, not the Portuguese as a country, but the Portuguese individuals are essentially trying to trade more like capitalists, because of their government's restrictions. There's also a lot of corruption among officials in the Portuguese government, and so that also hinders their strength. In the 17th century, the Dutch and English also emerged as major rivals to the Portuguese trade in East Asia. They, in particular, are interested in gaining possession of modern-day Malaysia and Indonesia, and this results in some wars. So in 1620, the Dutch captured Malacca in present-day Indonesia. So you can see on the map, right? This shows up as blue, which signifies that these are all Dutch possessions. And then the Dutch attempt to monopolize the spice trade. So basically all this stuff in blue, this is all stuff that the Dutch gained from the Portuguese. The English, by contrast, focus on India, and eventually they push the Portuguese out of South Asia. So this rise of more northern European colonial ventures, right, which is actually prompted quite a bit by the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. This ushers us into an age when the Dutch and the English also are significant contenders for influence over the Far East. All right, so let's move on to the Ching Dynasty. We probably won't finish it in one video, but we'll see how we go. If not, we'll just do a part 3. So the Ching Dynasty, this comes to power in 1644. So this immediately succeeds the Ming Dynasty. There's no gap in between like we sometimes see in Chinese dynastic rule, right? So the Qing are also outsiders. They're not Han Chinese, right? They're actually Manchurian, so they're coming from farther north. The Qing Dynasty starts because a peasant revolt, which was led by a minor official named Li Zicheng, ends up conquering Beijing. And he then establishes a very, I maybe exaggerated a bit. There was a very super brief dynasty in between the two. There was the Shun Dynasty, S-H-U-N, but it lasted only a year. So, for simplicity's sake, let's just say the Qing Dynasty immediately succeeded the Ming Dynasty. The AP readers are not going to get that particular. So the Manchus took advantage of the sack of Beijing, and they seized power. And then the Qing Dynasty is born. So the Manchu people ousted and killed the inexperienced Li Zicheng, right, the guy who established the Shun Dynasty, which is why it's so super short. And then the Manchus established the Ching Dynasty, which sort of overlaps with the previous Ming Dynasty, and then we see it start to get much larger, right? So pay attention to this map here for a second. This was the original Ching Dynasty, right? This is where the Qing people were from. So it's actually pretty significantly, focused on the north at first. And then as time goes on, we see other territorial acquisitions by the Qing. They then shift their focus down south, and then eventually they conquer all this western territory. So as you can see, by the height of the Qing Dynasty, it more or less represents present-day China in terms of its political boundaries. What else? The Manchurians, again, gradually move into China. They take advantage of all these new lands. And after about 40 years, the Manchus pacify the rest of China. They are able to get rid of the existing Ming resistance to the Qing. And the Qing Dynasty is very strong. It lasts over 250 years, and again, it falls in 1911. So let's do some comparison between the Ming and the Qing. In some ways, we see this interesting evolution, and it is significant. A lot of times we don't pay attention to things like fashion, but it does sort of show us the evolution between the Ming and the Qing. So the Manchu people, the Qing, they were much more distinctive from the Ming Dynasty. They were ethnically and culturally different from the Ming. So they're also less tolerant of Mongol leaders, and they resolved to make their culture much more dominant in China. So the Qing people actually do things to sort of stand out from the Ming. For example, they abolished marriage between Ming and Qing people. Men were obligated to dress in the more traditional Manchu style. So that's most evident by their hairstyle. In the Ming Dynasty, men wore their hair long and normally tied them up in buns. And in the Ming Dynasty, this was the more traditional hairstyle. So men actually shaved parts of their heads and then wore the rest of their hair in a very long braid. So you can sort of tell the difference in art. If you're looking at a depiction of a man, if his hair looks like this, we're talking about the Qing Dynasty. And you may, if you're more of a U.S. history person, you may notice that in the early years of Chinese migration to the U.S., most specifically to California, there was a lot of xenophobia between Americans and the Chinese immigrants. And part of it was because these immigrants looked so different from the Americans. The migrants from China to the United States, to California during the gold rush, most of them wore their hair in this fashion because it was during the Qing Dynasty. So that almost further alarmed the Americans when they saw these men who just appeared so different, right? This long braid, for whatever reason, sort of alarmed them. So you can kind of make that connection to U.S. history if that's your cup of tea. What else? Women, one of the biggest differences, between women and, let me start over. One of the biggest differences between women in the Ming and Qing Dynasty was in terms of foot binding. So it was the Qing Dynasty that outlawed foot binding. The first emperor did that, but it did take a very long time to implement this. Realized that it was very hard to enforce the no foot binding rule the farther away you got from cities, right? If you lived in a really remote place, it's not like a government bureaucrat necessarily is going to hunt you down and punish you. So you do see the continuation of foot binding for several decades after it's abolished, but this does show us that the Qing Dynasty is attempting to get rid of that practice because it was essentially seen as barbaric in the Qing government's mind. And also the Qing were never Han Chinese, so they don't care about a practice that was so popular during the Song Dynasty. They're not part of the Song Dynasty, so they don't want it, right? Foot binding was not ever part of the Manchurian culture, so it makes sense that they get rid of it. Let's see. To talk about more specific politics, I am thinking that just to put these videos in more reasonable chunks, I'm going to take a break now. So we'll pick up with some of the more specific leaders of the Qing Dynasty in just a moment, so stay tuned.